Internal equity. We hear this term a lot. What does it mean? So simply put, internal equity is paying similarly for similar work. There are laws that prohibit discrimination based on gender or other factors in relation to base pay, but also on other compensation pieces as well. Effectively, this means that organizations are expected to have a standard in which they set pay that is based on pay factors and not and the work that they are doing and not the individual. So let's talk a little bit about this term of equity versus equality. So as we've discussed, equity is paying similarly for similar work. Equality is paying the same. So we've seen organizations in the last couple of years explore this idea, specifically in the nonprofit world, about paying all employees the same, or at least similarly, regardless of the type of work that they do. This would be everyone receives a salary of $75,000, regardless of what you're doing in the organization. So this is challenging, and I haven't necessarily seen this take hold, although it is definitely being talked about currently. There's challenges around this, and this is probably why it hasn't necessarily, most organizations have not jumped to this. So first, determining what that salary should be. What do you base it on? Is it a standard of living? Is it location? Is it another amount that just feels right? A personal family situation can vary widely, and salary requirements also vary widely. So determining what that fair salary is a big challenge. You'll always have employees who have a different view of what is considered fair. So going that route and determining exactly one salary for everyone has challenges that may actually counteract the culture and the values that you're trying to instill.
I can't help thinking, Monica, of similar situation in unlimited PTO, right? There was a trend to just offer everyone unlimited PTO. And same sort of thing. How do you treat everyone equally or equitably in that scenario when some take more than others and some have different situations where they might need more time than others? And what does that mean? There's interesting parallels in when we go down a trend and frequently bounce back to the middle.
Yeah, definitely. And this, we've seen this happen in lots of situations, things like that as well. So, you know, there's always going to be challenges in any large policy change such as that. The unlimited PTO is definitely a good example of it creates some additional challenges that you just have to be prepared for if you want to go that route. Something else to think about in terms of equal pay for all employees is recruitment. So if you find someone for a role and their salary expectation is $40,000 a year, for example, and you offer them $75,000 a year, probably not that difficult to find someone that will take that pay. You're increasing significantly. However, if you're looking for a highly skilled worker, maybe who has a lot of experience, typically earns $100,000 for their work, offering $75,000 would be a tough sell. And how do you combat that recruitment challenge? My thought is that you're going to be severely limited in your candidate pool, and you may not be able to attract the right type of talent for that specific position. And lastly, my concern around this is just implementation. How do you implement this type of program if you don't have it already? Philosophically, employees may agree. However, they will likely inevitably be asked to take a significant pay cut, at least some individuals. So retention and morale become a much more specific and real concern. So as we've discussed, market pay philosophy and equality versus equity are difficult to reconcile. But another way to think about market-based pay is that all employees should be paid according to the market pay for their job. This would focus compensation on the job function and the job responsibility, and it eliminates other areas where biases could enter. There are other ways to implement equality into a compensation philosophy, maintaining consistent benefits across the board, perks, vacation, time off, and other policies, collaboration at all levels for professional development opportunities. These are areas where employees can be treated the same. And not necessarily unlimited PTO, kind of to Jill's point, but something that would be consistent. You're with the company for 1 year, you get this many weeks of vacation, and they can be, obviously tenure based as well. And really, at the end of the day, as long as an organization is consistent in their approach, market-based pay and a value of equality can operate together effectively. It's just a matter of determining how to make that happen. So that was a lot of words, I apologize. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the equity analysis. And we talked a little bit about this earlier in relation to equity and making sure that we can look at internal equity through a compensation system. So there's some challenges with doing this. It's not cut and dried, and there's not just one way to do it. So a couple of the challenges that you could potentially face through an equity analysis is varying functions. So you have varying functions and you have very few employees. If you have an organization of less than 10 and they all do different things, how do you determine if people are being paid fairly for the work that they're doing? You don't necessarily have similar work in order to give similar pay. Tenure is another issue. You have individuals who have been with an organization for a very long time. They have consistently, potentially, seen annual increases. They have developed relationships, especially with mission-driven work. There's some definite individualistic traits that you need to be able, and relationships that are built through that you need to be able to maintain. So tenure can be a big issue when you're looking at people who might do the same thing, but they've just been around a little bit longer. So when we do an equity analysis, you're trying to find people with like skills, like jobs. The requirement is similar pay for similar work. How do you determine what that similar pay is? Especially, as I mentioned before, when you don't have a lot of individuals in the same role. So determining who to compare who to is a challenge as well. And it's definitely something that we have had to combat with our smaller organizations that we've worked with. And then location-based differentials. Prior to having a structure, there has been a guidance to ask potential candidates what their salary requirements are. And if their salary requirements are lower, organizations are likely to meet those salary expectations. When individuals live in different locations, their salary expectations could be very different, especially historically. So you may have locations differentials built in without even really understanding that it's happening. So these are all things to think about when you're doing an equity analysis of how do we combat all of these challenges. Let's talk about transparency. So transparency is something that we see a lot in terms of a value within organizations, especially in the nonprofit world. Transparency is great. It is a great value, and it can help an organization build a culture of trust. You're communicating regularly to your employees. You're telling them what the strategic initiatives are and the goals and what they can expect in the future. There are some challenges when it comes to compensation and transparency. So first of all, the organization has to be ready. An organization that's never discussed compensation before with its employees, they're going to experience some shock potentially when it's presented for the first time. Employees might not have ever even thought of compensation in the ways that your organization does or your leadership does. If transparency is new and a new value for you, I highly suggest undergoing change management process to slowly introduce these ideas. It can't just be a drop it on the table and expect everyone to go, okay, great, yeah, this is fantastic. You have to work up to it and get employees aligned with why an organization would be doing that. The next question to ask is, what do we share? There are employees who come from very highly transparent organizations. Government, for example, would be one of those, where everybody knows how much every job pays. We know exactly how much the person sitting next to us makes, and we likely make exactly the same down to the penny. So they value that, and individuals who are used to that see that that is completely transparent and it's a positive. However, there's others who value their privacy and would prefer that their compensation not be shared. They look at more transparency about their personal situation as a violation of personal information. So as you can see, there's what is shared and can either be it can either support your culture or it can deteriorate it. So this is why living by your values and aligning with them to compensation is so important. You're living through and making sure that employees are following you along this journey in a way that is sensitive to the culture that you're trying to build or maintain.
Well, and I would just add to this that there are so many nuances, right? You as a nonprofit can create a culture of transparency, but that doesn't mean that every piece of information has to be transparent. And so we see this across the board, varying degrees of saying you have a transparent culture, but really it may be variable. And it may change over time, and that's okay too.
So let's talk about cost of living adjustments, lovingly known as COLA, that I'm sure everyone has heard of. So many organizations choose to use COLA as a mechanism to increase salaries, and they communicate it like that to employees. This usually looks like an across-the-board increase to all employees. Everyone is getting 3%. Everyone is getting 4%. So the first thing that I would just like to point out is that a cost of living adjustment is just that. It is an adjustment. This means that by definition of an adjustment, it could go up or it could go down. So if you're using this term as a way of determining pay or pay increases, you're effectively saying that there may be some years where an employee's salary could go down as part of this adjustment. Everyone knows we are living in a time of very high inflation. And if there is a market adjustment through a potential recession or an adjustment of some other reason, the metrics guiding COLA could very well be adjusted downwards. So just something to keep in mind, that terminology and that verbiage is indicative of something that employees might not be realizing. The other thing is that this idea of cost of living, it could be viewed very differently based on where or how someone lives. So it begs the question, does it cost the same to live in San Francisco, California versus Stillwater, Oklahoma? I would say no, it does not cost the same. What about an individual who's a sole wage earner for a family of 6 versus a dual income household of 2? And then you add in those 2 areas, one in San Francisco and one in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and you are looking at some broad differentials. My point in all of this is that the cost of living is subjective and unfortunately will be viewed differently by every individual. So just something to keep in mind as you're using that term around your organizations. And thirdly, across the board increases, and we go back to this internal equity theme that we've really had through this whole thing, across the board increases can actually exacerbate an internal equity issue if they're present. You might not even know that it's present, but it can definitely exacerbate it. If you have an issue where 2 employees are paid differently for the same work, by increasing their pay by both of their pay by 4%, you've first of all not necessarily helped that issue. You've also just increased the cost of that mistake by 4%. Technically 8% because you've doubled it and for both of them. So these are things that you have to take into consideration when you're using that term of COLA. Sometimes we recommend to our clients to maybe remove that term and use something else instead. Something like annual increases, budgetary increases, merit increases if you wanted to go that far and have it be tied to performance. But trying to steer away from this one term because it could very well be riddled with issues in the near future. So we talked a lot about location. We've actually brought this up a few times. So I want to talk a little bit about location-based considerations. This is a key point in your compensation philosophies. It's one of the first questions that we ask when we are helping organizations develop compensation philosophies. So put in a wonderful little chart here of the United States and some various different pay analysis for different locations across the country. So you will notice that the darkest of the blue, and I apologize if this is too small to read, but the darkest of the blues is the highest cost, and then the lighter it gets, the lower cost that they get. These are percentages, and they are based off of the percentage and matched towards US average. So if you take all US salaries and you average them together, the average based on location is going to be adjusted based on the location that somebody lives and works as well. So if you can see that, you will see the San Francisco Bay Area is, I believe it is 115%. So that means it is 15% higher than the US average. If you look at a place like Phoenix, Arizona, it is at 94.4%. So you are looking at almost a 20% differential between San Francisco Bay Area and Phoenix, Arizona. This can be significant, right? And these location differences vary. You have to think about, if you are going to go to a regional model, the financial feasibility of this through growth. You start to hire somebody in Florida, let's say, it's going to be a lot different than the Bay Area. Internal equity also becomes a consideration. So we have seen lots of organizations think through this in terms of, if somebody lives in a different state or a different location, how do we determine if they are being paid according to our internal equity philosophy? Because they are paid differently just based on their location alone. So some things you want to think about is the current population. Where are your folks currently? And how are they being paid currently? I understand there are lots of organizations that have allowed employees to just move. And that has been, they've kept pay the same potentially. You also want to think about employee tax treatment. So when you do that, different states tax at different rates. There's different income rates, there's income taxes. There's also states that don't have income tax at all. And then you have states that have very low or no sales tax. So the salary just goes a lot farther. And then you want to think about your planned growth and strategic plan. Where do you want to be? If you're going to be expanding, how does this look? So this is another thing that we recommend to our clients in making sure that employees understand what total compensation is. So I think we can all agree base salary is part of total compensation. Any variable pay programs, part of total compensation. I gave a little bit of a definition here in terms of bonus, and just a point here around making sure that achievement metrics in order to obtain a bonus are clear and defined. And ideally, they're tied to individual performance with clear line of sight to organizational goals. You want to make sure that everybody understands what you're trying to achieve here. Something else that should be in that bucket of total compensation is benefits. How much are you paying for your employees to have benefits? You likely cover quite a bit of that premium. Do employees know that? They likely don't, or unless you've been putting it in front of them potentially on pay statements or a total compensation statement of some sort. Something that's a little bit less, not as easy to quantify, professional development and job sharing. These are big benefits to employees and things that they might not be able to get elsewhere. So that is also of high value to employees. Time off plans. We talked a little bit about this too. The time that an employee is not working but being paid is a cost to the organization for the benefit of the employee. So something to keep in mind when you are talking about total compensation to your employees. And also flexible schedules and work locations. These are perks and benefits, where somebody gets to work, where somebody gets to live while they're able to still work. Also something that is important to a lot of employees. Flexible scheduling. As Jill mentioned earlier, our HR consulting team has flexible schedules, and a lot of us have been in HR for a very long time and would like a little bit more flexibility. That is a big benefit. That is part of the total compensation package for our team. So these are all things to think about in terms of what an organization provides to their employees. And I would very much recommend that you look at all of these items and start to think about how to communicate that to your employees.
And if I can jump in here, Monica, this topic is a good one. And I think especially now, given our trends of this grand exodus for employees and challenges around hiring, looking at all of these components and carefully considering all these components and then publicizing these components are key way for you to show value to your employees and to those candidates that are looking to join your organization. So a lot of companies do total comp statements. Actually, when I say a lot, I don't see a lot actually spending the time to do this fully, to the point of maybe once a year submitting individual statements to each employee. But if you have the bandwidth to that, there is a lot of value to really laying out visually all that you are offering to your employees. So I would just recommend that that be something that you consider if you feel really strong about all that you're offering to your employees with all these different components that are in front of you. Promote it to your employees.
Yeah, excellent point, Jill. And I think that there are a lot of things that employees don't think about. To this point, there's even more. There's, if you do education reimbursement, those kinds of things as well would be added in. Something to think about if, to Jill's point, organizations might not have the time to put those statements together for every employee on a regular basis. If you add this into your compensation philosophy statement and you're making that public to your staff, you can state, we expect that we are paying 47% of your total compensation in benefits and perks, and these are what they are. You can add in what those look like, kind of an aggregate, and then employees who are really curious about this, it makes them start to think about what it is that the organization is really paying for them, and things that they aren't necessarily thinking about. One thing that was really interesting, we did a focus group for a client surrounding this and asked the question, what does total compensation mean? My favorite response was, I didn't know, so I Googled it, and wow, there are a lot of things that are included in total compensation I had no idea about. This was amazing to actually go through this process to find out. So even if you think it seems like a no-brainer, putting it in front of your employees to show what it is that an organization is actually providing for them is a huge benefit